So, Jean-Francois, let's start with what happened today, the big meeting. We talked about this, I think, last week. François Legault and Justin Trudeau over Quebec and immigration and the threat of potentially a referendum if Quebec doesn't get what it wants. So today, what we do know is the feds agreed to kick in $750 million. Apparently, that's not good enough. François Legault wanted $1 billion. And in terms of the number of, I guess, in this particular case, people coming into Canada, or at least into Quebec and temporary foreign immigrants, this is what Justin Trudeau said after the meeting.
Mr. Legault is talking about targets that he has without a plan to reduce the numbers that are directly controlled by Quebec. Quebec itself controls over half of all the temporary immigrants in Quebec. They need to come forward with a proposal. And if they want to do more, well, we need to do it together.
Okay, that doesn't sound all that promising. So what do you make of what happened today from what you do know?
Well, on this particular point, I think Justin Trudeau has a point. And I've been saying for a long time that if Mr. Legault wants to have a decrease in the number of foreign temporary workers and students, which he controls, well, he has to give us the plan. Now, he said today, and that's the first time I heard of that, and I'm trying to follow this pretty precisely.
Mm-hmm.
For the first time, I heard him asking for 50% reduction in temporary workers. All right. He didn't say he said in short order, in a matter of months. Okay. He said, well, I control a portion, but it has to be done in collaboration, and I understand why. Is because if you don't do this in collaboration, then a business owner wanting temporary workers, if the Quebec quota comes down and not the Canadian quota, it will simply switch to the Canadian quota. But I don't see, and Legault didn't say, we have a targeted plan by industrial sector, and we tabled it to the federal government to ask them to match it, and they didn't. I don't see that. It's as though they're asking for the federal government to start doing that, and they will adjust. So I think Justin Trudeau has a point on that.
So how does François Legault then deal with this? Because, the talk last week was he talked tough and he said if we don't get what we want, he's considering a referendum on what he called autonomy. So based on what you do know that happened today, does he come back to simply say, okay, we got $750 million, so no referendum? What do you think happens next?
I think he took the referendum off the table pretty quickly. He only teased the referendum at some point, and then he took it out and said, well, we have polls showing 65% of the Quebecers would vote yes, so there's no point in having a referendum. What he announced last Friday is a committee to see if Quebec could act unilaterally in some manner in terms of constitution or fiscally to try to expand Quebec's autonomy without going to a referendum. So this still stands. This committee will work and will give its report sometime in October. But on the other issues, so they have $750 million. Quebec says, well, it really did cost us $1 billion, and these people are under federal jurisdiction, and so it's for them to pay. So I haven't seen, the bills. I don't know which is the right amount. But if it's true that it cost $1 billion and you have 750, you've just been had by $250 million. That's not small change.
Yeah, of course, that's what he says versus what the feds think it is. So maybe there's a middle ground. I still think when you walk away with $750 million, Jean-Francois, that's not a bad day's work.
Well, unless you're out of pocket by $1 billion because of what the other guy did. So I wish that you and I could hire an accountant that could come back to us with a real figure, because we are only relying on what these guys are saying.
Yeah, that's true. Let me move on and talk about something else. And again, I'm curious for your take on this, even though it doesn't necessarily happen or have anything to do with what's going on in Quebec. We're starting to see in Europe, and this sort of, I guess, came to a head to some degree in France yesterday, where Emmanuel Macron decided to call a snap election based on the fact that far right-wing politicians, parties in Europe are starting to win votes. And he's like, this is a bad sign. We better have an election. What does this portend?
Well, first you have to see that the right-wing parties have been growing slowly over the last 20 years in France, elsewhere in Europe, not everywhere, but Germany, Austria. They've lost some seats in Scandinavia, but whatever, in France, they went from being about 20% of the vote to more than 30%. And it's very, very symbolic in France to cross the 30% threshold in a divided political system. And the other interesting fact is that the governing party got half of this 30% vote. So it's really a shellacking, as Obama once said about his losses. And so, of course, these were European elections. And the center parties still hold a majority in Brussels, so there won't be a change there. And the Macron government, he is an elected president until 2027. He has a very weak majority in his own parliament, and there was nothing in the Constitution that forced him to call for new legislative election. This is really his call. He decided to do this in a purely French way of trying to strategize tridimensionally and at the fourth degree. And normal politicians would have said, listen, I'm in power until 2027. I'm going to stay. I'm going to do my best, and then we'll see. But what Macron says that he's going to remain president for the rest of his term, then he cannot be a candidate again. But he says, okay, I'm going to try to shock the nation into saying, well, do you really want to have a majority in the Legislative Assembly that is far right? And if you do, then the prime minister I will appoint will be far right. So this may happen within a month. And then we think that his thinking is that when these guys start governing, it will be such a disaster that when the presidential election comes in 2027, my candidate, my successor will be elected. Well, that's not a sure thing, you know. It may be that people basically like this new far-right government. You know, it's not unheard of. And so it's a really odd decision in his part.
But more broadly, what does this mean when you start to see government after governments, or people at least, leaning far right? I mean, that's a reason to sit back and worry, is it not?
Well, it is. It is, absolutely. But it means also that that mainstream parties have failed to address situations that are very close to the electorate. And in terms of managing immigration, managing inflation, and respecting nations. The European dream. There are two ways of seeing this. This is nations that come together and make compromise, or creating a central government that takes decisions over the will of nations. And so these parties are really representing a will. The national will of each nation, not to break out Europe, but to make sure that it does not become a central government. And the electorate has said that many times, even in referendums, saying we don't want to have this central government, just cooperation. And basically the elites ran over these decisions. So they've lost credibility. And these other guys are saying that they will do that.
Let me ask you one last thing, which has nothing to do with any of this. That's the fiasco on Peel Street during Grand Prix and the shutdown of all those terraces. Today we found out one person in the fire department has been suspended, but there's obviously a lot more to this story. What did you make of all this?
Well, from listening to all the interviews, I understand that the reason why they checked during the evening at 9 o'clock is because some of these restaurant owners are going over their capacity at these peak hours. So that's when you have to check. And if there's over peak capacity, then the policy is to say, well, you have to take out 3 of the tables.
But hold on. Let me stop you, because the issue here wasn't, from what we understand, peak capacity. It was the fact that the terraces themselves did not comply with federal or with fire regulations. So
going to check capacity, they checked other things as well, because there was a big fuss about why did they go at peak hour. Or they went to peak hour to do that, but then they saw that there was non-conformity in terms of some of the fire regulations, and were not aware that these particular restaurants had deferments on that very issue.
Right.
And so they were, they overreached. Even if they were certain that the restaurants did not conform, they should have said, listen, it's okay for tonight, but tomorrow it's gone.
Right.
And then they would have had the time to be told that there was a deferment. And that's the catastrophe. And, I think this is so painful because over the last 10, 15 years, Montreal has become the heaven of terrace. I mean, we're like in Rome here now. There used to be a time there were very few. Now they're all over, and the Plante administration, during the summer, some of the streets are closed, and the restaurants just expand in the street, and that's great. But this is completely forgotten because of this disaster.
Okay, we will leave it there. Jean-François, merci beaucoup. We'll talk to you again later in the week.
Merci à mercredi.
All right.